I can't think of a better way to finish off our series of guests than with today's guest. And like a few of our other guests, Jeff Howe is a professor here at Northeastern. Jeff teaches multimedia journalism courses in the School of Journalism in the College of Arts, Media, and Design. He's an assistant professor with a research interest in multimedia. He is also a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. I did not tell him already that the Nieman Foundation was one of my architecture clients about 10 years ago, but we can talk about that later. He's a contributing editor at Wired magazine, where he's covered the media and entertainment industry, among other subjects. Previously, he was a senior editor at Inside.com and a writer at The Village Voice. In 2008, he published the very influential book, Crowdsourcing: How the Power of Crowds is Driving the Future of Business, and writes the blog crowdsourcing.com. In his 15 years as a journalist, Professor Howe has traveled around the world on stories ranging from the impending water crisis in Central Asia, something we could talk about, to the implications of gene patenting. He's written for U.S. News and World Report, The Washington Post, and Mother Jones. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Howe.
Okay. Thanks, George. How you guys doing? Good Thanksgiving? All right, great. All right, so George, thank you for the introduction. That about sums up who I am. Let's talk a little bit. I always like to get an idea of who's in the audience. How many people have heard of crowdsourcing? That's weird and stunning. So what George didn't mention, it'll come. So I coined it in 2006, and it is a trippy ass thing when you think up some word with your friend, and then 8 years later, a bunch of people you've never met are like, oh yeah, I've heard of that. So it never fails to kind of shock and amaze. All right, so I'd like to kick things off with a video. We have to kill house and stage lights production person, and especially stage.
For the entirety of human history, the crowd was dependent on proximity. We had to be together physically in order to create a crowd. Suddenly, with the internet, we were able to create a virtual crowd. And what this allowed is it allowed people to get together through intent, through shared interest. This is new. This is a fundamentally new development in the course of human history, that communities are able to form simply out of shared interest, shared passion for a hobby, a craft, an art. So crowdsourcing is when a company takes a job that was once performed by employees and outsources it in the form of an open call to a large, undefined group of people, generally using the internet. There's a couple crucial terms in there. One is open call and the other is undefined, and they both get the same idea, that the person who you think would be best qualified to perform a job isn't always the best person to do it. And the cocktail party version is very simple. It's crowdsourcing is Wikipedia with everything. Photography is a great example because it's what I think of as the canary in the coal mine. What's happened over recent years in photography is the advent of three separate developments. The first is the digital camera, the cheap, affordable SLR digital camera. The second is photo editing software, which has become easier and easier to use. And the third, of course, is the internet. And so the quality level of stock photos produced by amateurs essentially reached an equilibrium with those created by professionals. What happened was that stock photos were no longer a scarce commodity. They became an abundant commodity. Instead of charging $300 per stock photo, they charged $1. And as you can imagine, the demand for a commodity that had been marked down by 99% was huge. I don't think crowdsourcing eradicates a business, it just changes it dramatically. It forces companies to approach us as potential partners, and that's much more interesting and much more exciting. We do buy things, but we also participate meaningfully in the process by which those products are created. what we see with these successful forms of crowdsourcing is that they came up organically from the people formerly known as customers, from the people formerly known as the audience. The technology is so good that it's become easier for people to become very good. And then finally, the emergence of online communities. I like to think about the online community as kind of the building block of crowdsourcing. It's what the corporation is to the industrial era. It showed that people could come together and self-organize into productive units. What once took managers in a corporate hierarchy can now be done in the context of the community.
All right. How many science majors? A couple? Can anyone guess what this is? Hella extra credit, if you can guess what this is. No? If you knew, would you say something? You guys seem kind of quiet today. Well, it is a molecular model for something called the monomeric retroviral protease. Which all sounds baffling and confusing. But the thing to know is that this particular protease is a crucial building block in AIDS. And understanding how the protease is structured, how the proteins fold that create the walls and the infrastructure of this molecule is crucial if we are to ever develop a lasting cure for AIDS. Some of the very best molecular biologists in the world had tilted at this windmill, had tried to solve this problem for 10 years when a researcher at the University of Washington had an idea. He decided that maybe the world's computers, when you weren't using them, could all combine and try to figure out how these proteins fold. The thing to know here is that proteins can fold in trillions of different ways. And so to try all those combinations takes an amazing amount of computing power, much more than any supercomputer at IBM headquarters. So the greatest supercomputer of all, of course, is all of our computers working together. But a funny thing happened, which was that people started emailing the University of Washington and saying, well, I see ways that it could fold that my computer does not. Why not let me go in there and try it myself? Like, I have better ideas than my computer. And so the researcher went and talked, went all the way across the campus to talk to a game designer, this guy Zoran Popovich. He said, how could we make this into, if you guessed it was a molecular model, you'd only be half right, because it was a video game, as we'll see. And in the end of October 2011, they published this article in the journal Nature, very prestigious, announcing that finally they had solved the structure of this protease. And they did it not through, hardworking, incredibly well-trained PhDs, but by making it into a video game. Some of the contributors were as young as 11. It took 2.5 weeks for some 200,000 people working together to do what the world's best molecular biologists could not do. Very few of these, if any, had a PhD. They weren't necessarily good at, they probably didn't know anything. They probably went in not knowing what a protease even was. But what they happened to be good at was pattern recognition, something that gamers become excelled at. And so that is crowdsourcing, is when you have thousands of people whose expertise you might not ever have thought could lend itself to the problem at hand. And one of the fundamental ideas is and the reason why that open call is such a crucial term is because you don't know what you think you know. We think that we want experts, but often we don't. Or we want a kind of expertise that we didn't even know could be applied to the problem. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how that word came into being, because it tells a lot about what the word has come to mean. So 2005 was my I've been at Wired for like 10 years, a little bit more, since 2001. And 2005 was like my year of the teen. I covered the music industry for the first 5-6 years that I was at Wired. And in 2005, file sharing was still it was a hot topic. It had literally ravaged the music industry. There was still enough of a music industry, worth some $10 billion a year in revenues, that this was a hot story. In the spring of 2005, I pitched a story to my editor on a site no one had ever heard of before. It was called Myspace. And when I first was writing about it, MySpace was known not as a social networking site, but as a place where bands and comedians and artists and designers could go to find a fan base. So they call it going from band to fan. A band could go on there and they could book their own tour and sell merchandise and sell their own downloads, and all of this sounds very commonplace today, but believe it or not, in 2005 it was shockingly new. To pursue this story, as anyone, I'm usually not speaking to audiences this young, so I'll be psyched if I see some hands. Has anyone been on the Vans Warped Tour? Have you gone to a Vans Warped? Nice. So I spent my summer going to Vans Warped shows because in 2005, this is where MySpace bands hung out. Most of them were, emo, post-punk kind of bands. Hawthorne Heights was who we chose to focus our article on. And so I spent my summer not just watching the music, but sort of getting into the whole carnival-esque atmosphere of a Vans Warped Tour. And what I noticed was that the musicians would get off stage and they would do, these henna tattoos, or they would have paintings, or they would do, they would publish books of poetry. And almost all of it was kind of bad, but that didn't concern me. What I thought was fascinating was that when I would go up and say, oh, like you're taking videos of all your friends' bands, you must want to be a filmmaker. You must want to be a videographer. And they would look at me like I was nuts. And they'd say, no, I'm just making a video. And I realized that their relationship to technology, and I'll go out on a limb here and say your relationship to technology is utterly different from my generation's relationship to technology, even though, I'm not that old. We're not separated by that many years. All of us at Wired had spent all this time focusing on the technology itself. But to the kids I was talking to, the technology was like a pencil. It was just a means to an end. You used a video camera because you had to take a video. You published a book of, you self-published a book of poetry because that was simply what you did to express what you wanted to do at that moment. And I thought, okay, this is a fundamental change. This is a sea change in the relationship between producers and consumers. When consumers have the tools to produce themselves, a lot is going to change. So I went ahead and published my article, and it came out and didn't mention any of this. Now, are there any journalism majors in the room? Not a one. One. One thing that happens with journalism is by the time you've published one article, you're so sick of that idea, you've totally moved on. And so I was asked to give a talk to the advertising executives at Anheuser-Busch about MySpace, which is kind of disturbing, actually, but I didn't think about that at the time, given that the average age of a MySpace user was not drinking age. And the night before, I decided I wasn't going to talk about MySpace at all, but I was going to talk about this idea that I'd had at the Vans Warped Tour. And so I did a funny thing. Everyone in 2005 was talking about user-generated content, but I just wanted to take the content out of there because I thought, people were looking at like kitty videos on YouTube and saying, oh, look, it's a revolution, kind of, small r, because people can make their own cat videos. Fucking cares about cat videos, right? I was like, no, this is going to be way deeper. This is going to change everything, and it's not about content. It's just about users making stuff. And I didn't come up with a lot, but I came up with one thing that was super helpful, and that was does anyone know John Fluevog? I think it's a West Coast thing. They make really big chunky, weird shoes that would have been really, really cool in 1993, and maybe if you live in Vancouver or Portland or Seattle are still cool. They have a very dedicated fan base. That's the thing to know about John Fluevog. People who wear Fluevogs will always wear Fluevogs. People who wear Fluevogs have 10 Fluevogs. So he had started something called open source footwear back in like, I don't know, a zillion years ago, like 2001, 2002. And the idea was simple. He wanted the people who loved his shoes to help design his shoes. Not all of them, just like several a year. And the way it worked was he turned this, these are the shoes that John has designed, into this. And what you'll notice is that the shoes themselves, the designs, are named after the people. And that's all they got. They didn't get paid. They didn't get to keep their intellectual property. And he didn't want aspiring fashion designers to create something in an AutoCAD system, something high-tech that would be sent. He just wanted normal people. He actually says in the copy advertising this that he wants people in bars to draw on crayon on the back of bar napkins. Like he's just looking for the seed of an idea that he can run with. And if you win, the chosen, you get named after you. So I took all of these ideas and I went and gave this talk, and I don't think anyone understood a word that I was talking about. Too fast, go backwards. But I probably the most unsuccessful lecture I've ever given. I didn't know what I was talking about. I didn't know what was out there. I didn't have any examples yet except for Fluevog. But I knew I was onto something. So I went back and I called my editor at Wired. And I didn't have the word yet, but I had a metaphor. I was like, okay, so I don't, it seems like, I don't even want to know how old you were in 2005. But hopefully you were online and have some memories of this. And again, this idea of user-generated content, and it was YouTube and Myspace, and it was an incredibly smaller space than it was now. And what I can say is all the people who are much older than you treated all this with an incredible degree of patronizing arrogance. It was some little toy that the kids were playing with, and no one thought that was going to blow up their industry. At least very few of us did. And I did. I said, this is much bigger. It's as if everyone were standing around staring at Old Faithful and being like, look, isn't this cute and pleasant? Every 57 minutes, this hot water goes 273 feet in the air, and this is interesting, and we can just walk away from all this because that is the phenomenon. The water shooting up into there, that right there is the phenomenon. Ignoring entirely the fact that the real phenomenon was 2,000 feet underground, and it was tectonic in nature. It wasn't local, it was global. And what I thought of all those other geysers that shifting magma was creating, that was going to be book publishing. That was going to be journalism. That was going to be advertising. That was going to be manufacturing. That was going to be higher education. And so I took this idea, and my editor said, this is good. This is good. And he said, it's as if, companies will begin outsourcing to the crowd. I said, or crowdsourcing. Fact is, I was kidding. I actually think out on the West Coast, they smush perfectly good words together and refuse to capitalize them. And as a proper East Coast wordsmith, I find it all very offensive and stupid. But writing for a West Coast magazine, I was always sort of making fun of Silicon Valley culture. And he said, no, you're not kidding. It's brilliant. That's genius. That's going to help us sell this in-house. Because getting 8 pages of real estate in Wired magazine is actually quite difficult. And at that time, I had to do it several times a year. So I said, okay, if it works. Had much misgivings about it. So the joke was on me when the proposal came before the collected editors. They said, well, the idea sounds a little nutsy, but we like the word, so we'll give you a green light. I worked on it for about twice as long as I usually work on my articles, about 6 months. Which is about, people sometimes write books in 6 months, all for 4,000 words. And it was for the reason that I thought the idea was a little nutty too. I wanted to make sure that I was onto something. And as you'll see with the rest of the slides, I was. I found a couple really key examples that proved my thesis. And since then, of course, it's kind of exploded. Article came out in June 2006. This was a screen capture taken just about 2 weeks before it went live, and this was about 2 weeks after it went live. And I don't put this up there to boast, or, I mean, it's not the best article I've ever written. It's one of the better reporting jobs I've done, but it was no fine piece of prose. I think instead it shows that a lot of people were thinking the same thing I was, and they were looking for a word that could be broad enough that it could be used in all sorts of domains, in design, in industry, in academia, and as indeed it has proven. I mean, that's the utility of that idea and that term, is that it can be used broadly. It's like a hammer. You can use it for all sorts of things. So I want to talk about some of the examples I found and why they're significant. In 2000, Jake Nickel and Jacob DeHart were both design school dropouts living in Chicago, and they were part of an online community. Hey, George, can you give me do you know how long I have? Got it, cool. Okay, so the Jakes, as they came to be called, were both members of this online community called Dreamless. And once a year, Dreamless would have a t-shirt design competition. Well, Jake Nickel won with this design, and Jacob DeHart came in second. And this brought them into contact with each other. They realized that they both lived in the same city, so they met to have a beer. And they had an idea over this beer, which is they said, you know what, Dreamless is kind of lame. This community is like, but the t-shirt design competition, it's the one time when everyone comes together and people get really excited to be part, and the forum boards light up, and it's really awesome and fun. Why don't we just drop all the other bullshit and we'll just have a t-shirt design competition? Can anyone guess where I'm headed? I don't know if it's hot anymore. I feel like it's threadless. Do you guys wear threadless t-shirts? Anyone? Wow. All right. The idea was this, is that people would design the t-shirts, they would submit the shirts, they would all talk about the shirts, and then a winner would be picked, and the winner would get to see his t-shirt fabricated and on the backs of his or her friends, and maybe a little bit of money. And if this had been 1990 or 1995, the straightest line from A to B would be, well, every week we'll get a celebrity, designer to come in and pick the winner, or we'll just pick it. It's that simple. It's an autocracy. We'll pick it. But because the Jakes had cut their teeth on the internet, they'd grown up on the internet, the straightest line from A to B was, well, the community designed the shirts, the community discussed the shirts, the community should vote on the shirts. And so they did. This was the Jakes' fateful decision, because what they did is they took a community that was small and niche. They never intended to, these were their people. They wanted to talk to their tribe. Their tribe was a subculture of designers interested in cutting edge design, that thought of the t-shirt as a canvas, as a platform for that design. But by saying you can vote on it and be the winner, they opened up that closed community. Because as it turns out, the people who like to vote on t-shirts is a vastly larger community than the people who want to design them. So Threadless might get 4,000 or 5,000 design submissions per week, but they get hundreds of thousands of people who come in and vote on those designs. And so this is just an example of how it works. Can anyone guess what this one's called? Make My Day. I think this one's cute. I say I'm going to give it a 5. And in the space of my coffee break, I've scored 20 other designs. And so I sometimes call that crowdsourcing labor force the coffee break labor force, because these aren't people who are going to spend 3 or 4 hours on a task. And this will come up when we talk about how crowdsourcing efforts are designed. Tasks are the most efficient when they are the most modular, which is to say that they're broken down into tiny little chunks that can be conducted, sort of like deer sleep, 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there. So this thing which the Jakes had, by the way, started as a gift for their community. They started it, in the proverbial garage. Actually, it was a Chicago apartment. But just to have fun, because they thought their community would love it, they wound up by 2007 with $32 million in revenues. That's with a 35% profit margin. What happened in 2008 is the Jakes realized that as a private company, they didn't have to tell a journalist what their financials were, so they stopped telling me. But I have it on pretty good authority that the company has simply continued to grow with similar margins. So we would say a unqualified success. This is what cheap labor used to look like, and this is what it looks like today. Anyone guess what this is? I'm not telling you this one. Thank you. All right, I heard the whispers. I just want to speak up. All right. I'm going to dash through some of this stuff here. It's just to say that not only does Threadless get this cheap labor, but they also get an incredibly granular idea of demand, not just through the voting, but through this I'd buy it checkmark, which means that Threadless, and this is stunning for any company that deals in atoms as opposed to bits and bytes, never has overstock. They always know they'll sell out. They sell out of everything they ever make. I mean, that's unheard of for a company that has to staff warehouses and deal in fulfillment. Which is, boring for those of you who aren't business majors. I kind of find it interesting. But one of the banes of existence for any retail operation. So what Threadless and some of these other examples show is something called Joy's Law, that no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. And what Joy meant is that even if you work for IBM, even if you go to Harvard, even if you are a pharmacist at CERN, or rather a physicist at CERN, which is the Swiss collider, thank you. Most of the smart people are going to be working somewhere else. And that's the idea behind crowdsourcing, behind breaking past those borders and opening it up to the crowd. Not just that most of the smartest people work somewhere else, or live somewhere else, or have other ideas, but that you don't know where that intelligence is going to be. You might not know that the people who are best qualified to figure out how a molecule is structured aren't molecular biologists. They're gamers. So I want to go through another quick example. So around the same time the Jakes were getting together in a bar in Chicago, Bruce Livingstone was running a web hosting and design firm in Calgary. Bruce had been a one-time punk rocker, had friends all around the world who were also in punk rock bands, and sometimes he would do free design for them, CD covers and posters. The problem was that he couldn't really charge them nothing because of a really straightforward problem, which is that stock photography costs money. So whenever he wanted to download an image to use in his design, it would cost $250, $300. So Bruce had a simple fix. He said, well, I'm a photographer. I'm kind of a crappy one, but I will upload all my photos and anyone can use them for free, so long as they upload their own photos. And so iStock Photo, as it became known, was a huge success. And again, just as we see with Threadless, it was created as a gift. It was created to give a community something. Jeffrey Zeldman, a well-known designer, says iStockPhoto.com does wonderful work and gives it away for free. What's the catch? There isn't one. Why do they do it? I'm just guessing here, but my sense is they do it for the same reason a lot of us put things up on the web, so others can enjoy and work with what we've created. Bruce then came to his own fateful decision. iStock Photo became so popular that he was paying out of pocket $10,000 a year in web hosting costs just to keep the thing running. He said, I can't do this anymore. It's one thing to give a gift. It's another thing to have to pay 10 grand a year for that gift. So he said, well, it's an easy fix. Instead of requiring that people upload their own photos, I'll just charge $0.25. And word spread like wildfire. if you were a photographer, an amateur photographer, you found out that there was a place you could go where you would actually get paid for your work. Millions and millions of people who loved photography who'd never ever been paid for the work, they don't care if they only get $2 or $3. They get $10 and they get to see their image in the Merrill Lynch annual report or whatever it is. Among consumers of these images, word spread even faster. Suddenly there was a place they could go where instead of paying $300, they paid a quarter. Price has since been raised. When I was working on it, it was I think $1.10, and it's not much more than that now. So here's a little parlor game to give some sense of the nature of this revolution. Is one of these is a Tiffany image. I paid $300 for it. Went to Getty and licensed it for $300. The other one, I spent $1.25. So here's A, and here's B. How many people think that A is the $300 image? Hands up. How many people think it's B? A little bit more on B. So I totally forget. I don't know. I created this ages ago, and my assistant at the time, we didn't label them. So I don't know, but that's the point, right? I mean, I honestly don't know. And I could not, I kind of suspect that it's, I kind of suspect it's A, but I couldn't tell you. And that's the point. And that was the nature of the revolution. So someone like Mark Harmon, who had been making $150,000 a year as a stock photographer, sometimes assignment photographer, I've sort of tracked him throughout the course of all this, has literally seen his profits, his income from stock photography erode to almost nothing. At the same time, what we've seen is a massive increase in the use of some really great photography. iStock Photo itself, it's much more than a website where people go to get cheap images. It's become a community of people who want to learn how to become great photographers and who want to teach others how to become great photographers. And like a lot of these crowdsourcing examples, this is all what we might think of as the dark matter of the economy. It's people shoot for iStock Photo and upload it and spend zillions of hours on the site, not because it's profitable to them in financial terms. It's profitable to them in, who knows, spiritual, psychological, emotional reasons. This is a great quote. Right as I was working on my story, I had called Jonathan Klein. He was CEO of Getty Images, is the Coca-Cola of this business. And I'd said, what's your attitude? And he said, these guys are amateurs. We're not worried about them at all. It's not going to affect our business. Within 2 months, before I had a chance to even close my piece, finish it, send it to the printer, he had changed tack and bought iStock Photo for $50 million. And basically said as much as, I lied before. If someone's going to cannibalize my business, better it be one of my other businesses. So iStock Photo's revenues on profit margins that even put Threadless's to shame, sometimes over 50% profit margin. Again, all from something that started as a gift. George? Getting close. Sorry. I'm going to skip a few slides. No, I won't. I'm going to end with one last example. Innocentive is a very different kind of company. It was started in 2001 by the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly. And the idea, it was very much driven by Joy's Law, that no matter who you work for, most of the smartest people work for someone else. And even though Eli Lilly employs some of the very best chemists and scientists in the world, multi-billion dollar company, they said, sometimes we get stumped. And wouldn't it be great if we could have a bulletin board and really smart people from Russia and Latvia and China and India, all countries which have vast amounts of intellectual capital, scientists with PhDs or not, running around with vast amounts of knowledge that we can never tap or had not been tapped before. So they created Innocentive to be that bulletin board where they could put problems up and people from outside their company could look and see if they had a solution. Well, InnoCentive became wildly popular. Eli Lilly spun it off. It became its own company, and anyone was able to post problems. Skip forward 13 years, or actually about 10, and this is how it works. These are not problems that would make sense to the layperson. Systems to monitor institutional corrupt, quantitative model to aid strategy decisions when applying open innovation. You can see that in these cases, the purse is much more than, say, the dollar you get with the iStock photo. It's $30, $50, sometimes $100,000. In 2008, this was studied by Kareem Lakhani at Harvard Business School because he was curious, why does this work when it works? And the first thing he found is that 1/3 of all the problems were solved, which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that these are problems that were so hard, huge companies like Procter & Gamble, IBM, Xerox, Eli Lilly had been unable to solve them. And some random person, I had focused on a guy who was installed HVAC systems up in Canada. He was, at the time I wrote my article, the most winningest solver. He had been on his way to a physics PhD when he had to leave and take care of family, but he still was an incredibly talented physicist. He just wasn't at a university. Exactly the kind of intellectual capital that would have never been captured before. Lakhani's findings get even more interesting, though. That there was a positive correlation between success and distance from field, which is just a really boring way of saying that the less someone knew about the problem, the better chance they had at solving it. And this sounds really counterintuitive, but I guarantee you something, if you're still listening 30 minutes on, it will be intuitive in 50 years. This is the idea, is that when you have a problem that, say it's a chemistry problem, that all that has stumped every chemist you've shown it to, then the solution does not lie within chemistry. For hundreds of years, our idea has been, let's show it to yet more chemists. The idea of diversity, cognitive diversity at Google, is instead of hiring dudes from Carnegie Mellon and MIT and Stanford, let's hire a few programmers from Ohio State too. The idea of diversity at InnoCentive is, instead of showing the chemistry problem to yet one more brilliant chemist, let's show it to someone who has a master's in crystallography. Let's show it to a doctor who, is a general practitioner in a rural town in Minnesota, but happens to moonlight trying to solve problems for InnoCentive. These are the kinds of people who wind up being successful solvers. And this, his final finding, really kicks this in. The winners knew the solution in 20 minutes, which is to say it had nothing to do with whether or not they were brilliant. They weren't. It's that they knew things that all the brilliant people didn't. And that really gets to the idea of crowdsourcing, especially there are many different types of crowdsourcing, but we call this like problem broadcasting, or having an open call for a problem. Is again that we don't know who the right person to do the job is. We only think we do. So I'll just quickly sum up with this. Sort of the why crowdsourcing came into being. One is an amateur renaissance. And it's a little hard to describe to people your age what this means exactly, except to say that there was a time not very long ago when people were hired to do one job, and that was what they were expected to do. You did not have a culture of avocation, which is a unnecessarily fancy way of saying that hobbies weren't as widespread and as eagerly practiced as they are, and as easy to become good at as they've become. A lot of this, I would argue, has to do with the GI Bill and the fact that vastly more people get a liberal arts education such as you're getting, but that's beyond the scope of this talk. Second, the open source revolution. How many people know what open source programming is? Good. Basically, you don't have to know much, except for the fact that hundreds of thousands of people will come together and create something for free that is a lot better, more efficient, vastly cheaper, often free, than the best minds at Microsoft or Google or Facebook can produce. That gave a blueprint for crowdsourcing.
When Jimmy Wales and Larry Sanger were first creating Wikipedia, they literally said, what if we created an encyclopedia that was like an open source software project? That was their model. The democratization of production, which I can explain really easily since George is an architect, he'll relate or disagree with me. If you wanted to design a house, let's say in 1985 or even 1995, or actually even, I would guess, 2002 or 2003, AutoCAD was an incredibly difficult to use and very expensive endeavor. There was a time when you had to buy an entire AutoCAD kiosk, right? You had to get the whole terminal and now, flash forward just a few years, and we have Google SketchUp, which is free, or the premium version, which is $79. So $150,000 over here, $79 over there. Think of what that does to the means of production. It's as if we took entire factories and we put them in the palm of your hand and said, give me a 20 spot for that. And that's actually literally the next thing. My book doesn't touch on this, but my new book will, is what's happening now to hardware and to manufacturing, partially because of 3D printing, but partially because this revolution just continues to move and is only gaining momentum. That the means of production are falling into all of our hands. And finally, the rise of online communities, which is simply to say that I may very easily be closer to someone who shares my deep affection and interest in fly fishing, random, if that person lives in Italy or Afghanistan or California, whereas maybe 50 years ago, I would have been much closer to my geographical community, regardless of what their affinities were. And there's good and bad that comes of that. But anyway, that's sort of the whys and wherefores for all this. And a few more slides, but I'm going to shut it down so we have time to do a Q&A. So thank you all very much for listening.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
And by the way, I was reminded while you were talking about even greater connections between you and our mutual friend Jack Hitt, whose most recent book is A Bunch of Amateurs, about the whole DIY culture from Benjamin Franklin to the present. Anyway, it's
I haven't seen it. I'll
Well, you know, there's two sets of issues I think that we can talk about. One of them is crowdsourcing as a sort of, as this widely influential, broad cultural phenomenon, but also if we narrow the nature of the problem a little bit to journalism, something I'm very interested in, and I think like a lot of these disrupted enterprises, is trying to understand what it's going to be like on the other side.
Yeah.
So like if we start with, first of all, I had Dan Kennedy last spring, and we had a great talk about this sort of evolution and that, by the way, massive change in journalism is not new. It's happened many times before, so don't freak out too much.
Yeah, that's right.
But that, because really, when people talk about reinventing journalism, they're really maybe overstating it. That in a way, what's really happened is there's been a massive change in the business model of journalism, where classified advertising no longer, perhaps inexplicably, supports all these other social goods like investigative reporting that we have gotten used to, but it never really made any sense that they were connected.
Yeah.
Craigslist happened. Suddenly there's no revenue for newspapers. Who's going to pay for all of these socially subsidize
Yes.
these things?
Who will subsidize the spinach when all people really want to eat is cake?
That is it.
Right.
And well, so it's two parts. To get started, it's two parts. You know, a friend of mine who is a journalist says that if you really boil it down, the most important thing that journalism provides is verification. That in a world of assertions, and especially in a commercial marketplace of people saying A or B, somebody has to be the voice of truth, and that's why people talk about it as the fourth estate, that it is fundamental to our democracy.
Well, and interestingly, this hasn't changed. I mean, it's something I tell my students all the time, is that you may in fact be competing with people who are smarter and better writers than you are, who don't even want payment for what they do. And that's often the case. I mean, if you want to go and be a movie critic, good luck.
There's plenty of people with law degrees who make lots of money and they love nothing more than to come home and write about movies from 9 to 11 p.m. before they go to bed, and you will never be as good as them. You will never write as scintillating and trenchant a movie review. But what you can do is report. For reasons that I've never totally understood, the general populace does not take to simply picking up the phone and calling random people and asking them questions. And we do that for a living. And so we vet, we do verify. And that is something that journalism will always have and that will always bring. And it has to do with accreditation. It's silly, really. It's because someone's told us that we could at some point, and we call that accreditation. I work at a newspaper, or I just freelance, I write a blog, and I'm going to say I'm a journalist. I'm going to have this imaginary badge, and that allows me to vet and verify. But it's significant, and that hasn't changed.
Right. Well, actually, when you put it that way, especially in the sort of accreditation mode, it brings to mind so many issues that we're very aware of today. For example, when they talk about shield laws.
Yeah.
Well, wait a second. Do I have to be a card-carrying journalist to be protected, have my sources protected? How about I'm just a day-tripping architecture professor, but I happen to write something on the internet about a crime.
Yeah.
And you're the police, and you want me to divulge my sources. I say, no. We have freedom of the press. They say, well, you're not in the press. Remember, in the movies they used to have guys with the hats with a press thing in their hat. Anyway, the diversification or the fragmentation that the internet has brought has made those kinds of things for journalists and architects, has called them into question.
Yeah.
You have SketchUp, who's to say your composition of a fabulous house on the ocean is inferior to mine because I'm a licensed architect.
That's right.
It's not obvious. So this whole business about journalism in general and how it is affected by this fragmentation, what do you see as the big advantages and the big disadvantages? In other words, surely in the Twitter universe, one gets access to more on-the-scene reporting from Syria or from Egypt or from anything now than you would ever have before. It might have once been that we relied on one or two correspondents, New York Times and AP,
Right.
and it was just two people in Syria telling the West what was going on. Now it's hundreds and thousands.
That's right.
Is that a good thing, a bad thing?
Well, it's a good thing if you're a consumer of information, and it can be a scary thing if you're a producer of information. I'm an optimist. I think that this is a democratizing force. I think that people who, we in the press had a monopoly over the gathering and distribution of information for a long time. And we were our own little guild with our own rules and conventions, and we protected them fiercely. And you had to play by certain rules if you wanted to get into the business of making public utterances. And that monopoly has completely disappeared. And I think that's great. I mean, I don't like guilds. I think guilds encourage a lot of mediocrity. And the fact is we can and I have and others are still bemoaning the loss of some great newspapers, but the fact is there was a lot of crappy journalism 15 years ago. Yeah. That movie to go back to
a lot of crappy lawyers, a lot of crappy architects. No
there's a lot of crappy, and there continues to be, and most of the stuff that's out there on blogs is really bad. But what you will notice is that a lot of the people who wind up being recognized, that the crowd, if you will, comes to recognize and read, are really funny, trenchant, smart, insightful blogs that sort of bubble up to the surface. Not because the person is, went to Harvard or used to work at Newsweek, although those things are also sometimes true, but simply because they're funny and smart and good and they offer something of value to their readers. That is a new system. And it's one that I think ultimately it's good for democracy. And I think it's good for all of us as a whole. I think we'll get a better product. I think we'll get better writing and better reporting.
Well, I think this is really interesting because, of course, I don't disagree. I love that I have tabs or bookmarks for 40 different news sources it's amazing, it's miraculous that I get any work done in my day at all with all of the different, opinion pieces that I can have access to at any time. But those are still, most of the ones, and at least that I link to, are still curated according to the traditional precepts of journalism, frankly. They may be different points of view, you know what I mean? One has a more European point of view, one is more right-wing, one is more left-wing, one is more whatever. But they still are accountable because they're organizations. It seems that the fragmentation, once you get, first we for example, I can subscribe, it's as though I can subscribe to way more magazines than anyone would have ever subscribed to in the past, right? I mean, you would never, in the old days, subscribe to 20 magazines because you'd become a hoarder and you couldn't keep up and you'd die. You'd be crushed by a falling stack of magazines. Now, they're all there to access when you want. So that's obviously a good thing. But the accountability front seems to me the other side of this coin, which is as there are more and more and more people blogging, sending me, we see it in the debate over comments in any of these news media, where are they anonymous or not? There's a movement now to build in a little accountability so that I have to know that it's Jeff Howe making this assertion, and you can't just say, this is terrible. This person is an amoral monster, and under the shield of anonymity.
That's right.
So it seems to me that this is a fundamental issue in the kind of transformation of journalism, is the maintenance of some level of, if verification is in fact going to continue to be the primary task, that accountability has to be part of it, no? I mean, are they going to have to develop new ways for accountability to be built in, even for individual bloggers and the like?
Well,
Or does crowdsourcing solve this problem?
Yeah, well, to some extent crowdsourcing does, and you could argue that the Times and the Washington Post and some of the larger, more widely read publications have used crowdsourcing to address it in the comments. I mean, you do have to use a name. It can be a fake one. No one's going to find out. But if you write something idiotic, no one's ever going to read it because it's very quickly going to get voted down into the nether regions of, and that is fundamentally, I wrote about that as a system. It actually dates back to 2001, 2002, a website called Slashdot, which is, it's called News for Nerds. And they had a voting system on their post. And so you could read what everyone else was reading. We see this emerge as Reddit. We see this emerge as what New York Times has used. So yeah, what we encounter is, it used to be that what we saw in our newspaper, our magazine, had been filtered and edited by someone very, very smart. Right. And that's a system, and it's not, it was an okay one, and it worked for a long time, hundreds of years. Now what we read tends to be filtered by an algorithm. Mm-hmm. And that's also a system. Mm-hmm. It's what's most emailed, it's what's most read. Right. And I don't always think that system works well for me. And what you'll see is our algorithms are now becoming personalized. The New York Times will recommend, here's what it thinks I should read. Netflix. Right, sure. Netflix, I think, makes terrible decisions about what they think I should watch.
I agree with you.
I have a kid, so it seems to think that I should watch, the new Teletubbies thing. It's, it gets very skewed.
As well as Henry IV, Part 2. Right.
It's Cheek by Jowl, yeah. These systems are I find myself reminding my students, my audiences, et cetera, that they're very rudimentary. Right, we're only in the very beginning stages, but we will see the crowd become, via this algorithm. It's often called collaborative filtering, or it used to be. We'll see that more and more broadly used, I think. For better or worse.
Well, this is very interesting, because this is one of the other things the challenge of putting together questions for these is it's almost always before I see the presentation. So I may end up asking questions that aren't as germane, but the business of this sort of automated, Amazon, Pandora style, if you liked this, then you'll like that. Do you think it is completely coincidental that there's a rise in that at the same time as there is an increase in polarization in our country politically? Do you think that, what I mean is, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Gosh, do I fit a stereotype of a Democratic voter in this country? I mean, almost everything about my buying habits, my web activity suggests that I live in a blue state and vote that way. The same, however, if I lived in Oklahoma, a very, very red state, and I saw only that kind of information because the Pandora, Amazon-type algorithms said that. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that it's just a coincidence that those two phenomena are occurring at the same time.
No, the short answer is I don't know, but the popular consensus seems to be that this phenomenon, Cass Sunstein called it the Daily Me.
The Daily Me?
Yeah, the Daily Me, like ME, because instead of getting a daily newspaper, you get information that is perfectly algorithm. I mean, it's not perfect, but in theory, that's perfectly pitched right to you. It means you never hear stuff you don't want to hear about, or things that may make you uncomfortable, and that has led to our increasingly polarized country, and to which I say, sure, I buy it. I don't know. I haven't done this research, but I buy it.
Well, if that's true, and I mean, I of course haven't done the research either, but my intuitive sense is
I think you're right.
It seems very unlikely that's just a coincidence.
Yeah, no, I don't think it is.
And so it would seem to me that if I were an innovator in journalism, as you and Dan Kennedy and other characters are, that this would be a really interesting, that's got to be on the shelf of problems to solve, is how can we, on the one hand, see, the trouble is that these new technologies, it seems to me, of course, and I'm not being critical of them inherently, but because they're at an early stage, but they respond to us as consumers, obviously. They don't respond to us, let's say, this is not an Enlightenment framework. This is not John Jay. This is not the framers, James Madison, establishing the criteria with the programmers at Amazon.
Right.
They don't say what you ought to be reading or what you ought to like.
Yeah,
I realize that's perhaps I'm now getting right back to maybe the role of the whether it was McCormick or William R. Murrow or Hearst.
Right.
Who were able to shape public opinion in a very specific way to a broad cross-section of our audience. I just wonder, do people in journalism see that as a problem that needs to be addressed, or are they so busy putting out other fires about the changing landscape of journalism that's not there yet?
It's pretty low on. I mean, saving our jobs is high on the priority list, and creating an educated, responsible citizenry is probably pretty low. Attitudes have changed as well. I mean, there was a time when newspapers were read by a lower class, and they were produced by, at least edited by, people who felt that they knew better and they knew what. And those attitudes obviously have shifted dramatically. And so the general attitude is, who are we to say? Right.
Well, it's interesting, by the way, that's a direct quote from the Pope, which is pretty astonishing. I don't know if you heard him recently. He said, "Who am I to judge?"
Right. Oh, yes. No, I did.
This is like one of the most amazing things to come out of a papal mouth in the history of
Pope Francis is amazing.
Of mankind.
Yeah.
But let's maybe migrate away from the sort of nobility of the Fourth Estate, or presumed nobility of the Fourth Estate. I know in my field, I find an inordinate number of conversations being around what a colleague of mine calls the narrative of loss. And I'm sure that happens in the newsroom all the time too. 1955 was the best time for journalism, or 1922, or my own hero H.L. Mencken, was that was what real journalism was. But let's I think that people say that about everything.
Yeah.
But they're on the more business side, on the more commercial application of this whole thing. I see a very interesting rise in curated sites, precisely as a response to, if you want, perhaps the almost like democratic excess of the web. In other words, look, yes, of course, it would be, I appreciate the freedom to choose from 50 billion options. But if you don't mind, I have 7 minutes. And I want somebody to have, and this is, of course, the role, perhaps, of the newspaper in many ways, is to, and the reason I like the facsimile version sometimes as opposed to the web version, because it curates in a way that I can connect with. Like, which are the big, important stories and which are the small, lesser ones. They tend to be the same size on web versions.
No, I think curation is just important. I'm curious how many people we still have here, but how many of you read the New York Times or any newspaper every morning? I can never tell when you guys go like,
Yeah, come on. Imagine that there's a $50 bill on the ceiling, and all you have to do is reach up and grab it. Okay.
Just have some sense. Okay, and how many of you read Reddit?
More read Reddit.
Yeah, and I mean, I would argue Reddit serves the, I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, it serves that same purpose, right? I mean, you only have 7 minutes, you glance at Reddit and get some idea of what's going on around the world, is that about right? Or like, what's going on around the world that you might be interested in? So, you know, people used to, you know, that used to be the Times, and now, but you're right, I mean, you know, if anything, that curatorial job is much more important now because there's, you know, you know, there is a embarrassment of riches out there, let's just say.
Right. Well, I wonder how, you know, some of these companies, you know, we were talking, well, first of all, I didn't know, I knew about iStock Photo. I didn't know that Getty had bought it.
Yeah.
And I didn't know about, I'm embarrassed to say, I didn't know about Threadless, but it's apparent, you know, it
Threadless may have come and gone, I mean, if no one here is wearing a Threadless t-shirt, that has, you know, I'll be honest, I haven't reported on them in a couple years. Does anyone here, how many of you had heard of Threadless?
Okay, now I'm going to try to
Did you like wear it in high school and now it's over?
I'm going to try to out-hip my guest, who is many years my junior, and say, how many of you have ever bought a Snorg t-shirt? Damn. Well, I guess Threadless wins.
Yeah.
They're the ones who always advertise on my
yeah.
my browser. I don't know why, as a kind of vaguely hip, you know, I don't know. Maybe it's aspirational hipness based on my actuarial information. Who knows what they're
What
kind of
the algorithm is.
Yeah, it's a kind of a Portlandia situation.
Yeah.
Anyway. Well, by the way, if anybody is we have, in our nod to crowdsourcing, we have the ability to tweet questions, which is not exactly groundbreaking, but please, folks, feel free to go ahead and do that if you like. Oh, here, we have one already. Let me try this. We have a journalism major. What is the relationship between journalism and design? And how would you explain that using she says 8 words. I'm going to assume she means the 8 words. We have, there are some words that we have been using to sort of tie together the disparate visitors to the course. One of them is context. And so, you know, perhaps the changing context of journalism. Another one is the question or the problem. What is it that you're trying to... Another one is empathy, and this is something that I'd be very interested to know about. Another one is iteration, visualization, innovation, metrics, and leadership. Now, all those words are more and less relevant depending on the, you know, on exactly what the person does. But I'd be interested to maybe sharpen this in terms of empathy. You know, for a lot of guests in this class, they've said that it wasn't until they really understood that their job of being really successful at designing whatever it is they design was to really inhabit, to the best of their ability, the user, client, recipient, reader's point of view. As a journalist, and especially as somebody who communicates to lots of groups, I know you make a lot of presentations, how do you see, you know, is empathy something that you're self-conscious about in your own work? And empathy for the reader, for the audience?
Well, on a day-to-day level, an empathic journalist will always, I don't know about always, but will generally speaking outperform one who's non-empathic because of the need to relate to sources. So I mean, and this may be less true of a newspaper journalist, which is on a new story every day, and or at least most of them, and
can really, I mean, I've worked with a lot of newspaper journalists, and also broadcast journalists tend to be this way. And they're not particularly friendly, and they're there to get the story, and they have a list of questions. They're going to get them answered, and then they're going to go. I tend to befriend my sources. I spend weeks with them. I stay in touch with them for years. I cultivate them. You know, some of them were at my wedding. You know, I've helped christen their kids. Like, if I was not able to, and there are lots of ethical problems in there, so I'm not even going to pretend there's not, because you know, so do I give them a free pass in my writing? I would argue no, but you know, it's, but that's one, and that's an empathy that has always been there. I will say this, and it's a more interesting answer, I think, is that we have never had to be terribly empathic with the reader. Because we never cared what you thought. We had the monopoly. You had to buy us whether you liked it or not. Certainly, in a town like where I grew up, Columbus, Ohio, you know, there used to be 2 newspapers. For all of my life, there was only one, and that's what you had. And now, both, in the way we design our websites, in the way we write our articles, we are very much self-consciously thinking, what does the reader want, and how does the reader want it presented to them?
Well, I would think that is true. I mean, actually, that's a great answer because, first of all, I hadn't thought at all about the reporting angle, the deep reporting, and I know I've spoken with Jack about this, and you know, he's done some very deeply reported things over the years too, and that in a way, you know, that's perhaps a more important empathy for that kind of writing. But now, in the last 10 years, in the digital revolution in journalism, in fact, we've had a lot of digital designers here too, the UI, UX approach, which says, you know, it does actually, the news is almost a commodity. You'll notice how, I think you'll notice, I certainly notice as a regular reader of the New York Times for a long time, that how the opinion section has risen dramatically in importance because that's what distinguishes the paper from a Google News feed. I mean, sure, the article about the train derailment will be a little bit better written, but you know, that's not a distinguishing factor the way having Paul Krugman or something like that is. And so it's migrated way up.
The fact that 4 died, 63 were injured, or 70 I think it is, and that the operator went into the turn going too fast is something that every news organization is going to have, and you can get that from anywhere.
Exactly. That's a commodity, for sure.
You know, for a lot of people, their relationship with the New York Times is Paul Krugman.
Yeah.
It's paulkrugman.com. It doesn't matter what else is.
You know, again, I am at the center of the demographic about which you are speaking.
Yeah.
but that's, but it is interesting because how you know, the digital, Dan Kennedy and I talked about this a few months ago, but the different interface that newspapers use on their websites is dramatic. First of all, they're dramatically different. The way they engage the public is dramatically different, even if what they're packaging is more or less the same stuff. And it's very meaningful. In other words, when you get, you know, I was one of those people who was very slow to switch from having the newspaper delivered, hearing the thump on my doorstep that I'd heard for decades that alerted me that the day was now in fact going to start. This fell apart for 2 reasons. One, a series of derelict newspaper delivery people who delivered it so late that I would have missed work if I waited for that. But, but finally, you know, the iPad, I got persuaded that, you know, give it a try.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And now, actually, I only have the Sunday New York Times delivered, and it's sitting unread on my on my counter right now because it's so easy to do this other thing. So it can really be transformative, I think. But there's a lot. If you look at the newsroom,
it's not the technological determinism, which is you know a fancy expression, but one that's a common attitude in the West Coast and the Valley, I think, which is that because technology exists, it will be better. Technology is in the business of making things better. Right. The fact is the newspaper is one of the shittiest consumer products that's ever been created. It got ink on your hands. It was unwieldy. It wasn't stapled. If you can't always fold it correctly. I mean, for 100 reasons, it was bad. The one thing it was good at was aggregating a bunch of otherwise totally unrelated information and getting an ad out to a local audience. It was excellent at that. And because of that one fact, that determined the UX of the newspaper. So I don't find it accidental at all that newspapers are hurting far more than magazines are. Actually, the weekly magazine is dying. New York Magazine just announced this morning. As a longtime New Yorker, I breathe at this, but going bi-weekly. But the monthly magazine, I mean, I can tell you Wired just had its best year. Not only is Wired reaching 10 times as many people as it used to, we're making more money at it. Because no one sells a Louis Vuitton handbag the way a magazine ad can. Not TV, not an iPad. There's something about putting something on 50
super heavy, shiny, glossy paper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A heavy, shiny, glossy paper that just makes it leap off the
I've
page.
heard, now that's so interesting, because, for example, Vogue, I'm told that is they have no threats to their market demand. The 500-page glossy magazine that's 80% ads or 95% ads.
Yeah.
It's an astonishing, these poor people at like Time and Newsweek must just say, what is wrong with us?
It's what's wrong is the fundamentals of a weekly business model, which is for reasons that are more sausage making than I really understand, just incredibly bad. I mean, the fact is that some people are going to get caught under the crunching, will get crunched under the wheels of change, and others are going to escape it. And to some extent, that's incidental and arbitrary. It just has to do with some business models adapted to this particular change better than others, but the change 10 years from now may not. I will say that I have my own personal half-baked theory that change is following its own version of Moore's Law. So Moore's Law being the principle that says that the storage on a computer chip will double every, I think it's 2.5 years.
18 months.
Yeah, right, every 18 months.
Yeah.
I think change follows that same exponential, that's...
God, if that's true.
I have one of the greatest thinkers in the news business, not someone many people know because he's not a public guy, but he's very powerful. He talks about a liminal age. And by liminal, he means an age of constant transition, where change becomes the new normal. It's not that change is a transition. I often think
I got you.
Yeah.
That's actually really, interestingly, and for students here, I think it might be interesting. I think that's actually one of the secrets to Northeastern University's success, is that change has been a constant and a regular thing during the entire time that this has become a top university.
Yeah.
There is no golden age to look back at.
Right.
There is no, why can't we keep it 1985 because that was so great, or 1956 or whatever. And I mean, I don't know, I'm a little startled by the Moore's Law analogy, only just because that talks about such accelerating dramatic change, and maybe that's true. But certainly what these people are being prepared for is an era of dramatic change. And we've already experienced such dramatic change, let's say in the last 20 years, that if it continues or even accelerates as your sort of exponential, I don't know if doubling every 18 months is exponential or logarithmic. I'm not good enough.
Yeah, I'm not either.
In any case.
But I'll say one, I don't know how close we are to closing, but I'll say one thing that these talks should always have sort of one mind-blowing thing.
Yes.
Has anyone seen, this will be really obscure, but George Church is a scientist at Harvard. Has anyone seen his TED Talk?
I haven't. George Church.
So one thing I'm looking into is biological computing.
Right.
And it's much further along than I thought before I had a meeting with, it's actually my co-author on my new book, had met with George, that he had walked out, and I haven't seen the TED Talk yet, but he walked out onto stage holding a test tube. And on it was copies of every book George had ever written in full text for every human who has ever inhabited the planet. Imagine that for a moment. Trillions and trillions of words. That's basically what would have taken just a few decades ago, like a continent worth of supercomputers could now be stored in a test tube about that big.
Right.
And the thinking is that biological computers will be vastly, and I mean vastly faster and offer vastly more storage. We will look at those server farms that exist outside of Reno that we all use every day without knowing it. When we go on Amazon.com, we will look at those as the giant IBM.
Right.
You know,
Univac.
we will laugh. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that is amazing, and perhaps the right moment to end. So, Jeff, thank you very much.